The telegraph's tapping in a London room before dawn sounded unusually clear and unusually slow. Each pause felt like a long breath held and released. Smoke hung almost motionless in the yellow halo of a desk lamp, as if the air itself had agreed not to stir. Several men in suits and uniforms stood around an enormous map table. They spoke little. More often, their eyes settled on the silent radio sets or on a marked coastline far from Britain, where ink and rumour would soon try to stand in for steel. This was not a frontline headquarters. There was no roar of guns, no whine of incoming shells, but the tension had a different texture, cold, suspended, branching into unknowns. Victory would not hinge on whether someone could seize a hill in the next hour. It would hinge on whether, 1,000 miles away, certain people would believe a story that had already been sent. A story they themselves had written, then sealed, with no chance to alter a comma once it left their hands. The plan was called Operation Mincemeat. And at this moment, the bait was already in the pot. Only days earlier, a body dressed in the uniform of a Royal Marines major, bearing the name William Martin, had been quietly placed into cold water off the Spanish coast near Huelva. A locked briefcase was secured to him. Now the designers of the plan waited in this room. They had released a lie into the world, and they were listening for its echo, waiting for the enemy to pick it up, take it apart, analyze it, and finally believe it. You could hear papers being turned and then closed again without thought. You could see coffee gone cold, untouched, as if warmth were a luxury no one dared to claim. Time here had been stretched into a thin steel wire. Every shift of attention sent a faint, heart-stopping tremor through it. A young officer murmured, as if to himself, "Now it's their turn." And the words hung there, not as bravado, but as an admission. Everything that mattered had already been pushed beyond reach. Yes, their turn. The turn of German intelligence, of Spanish officials, of anyone who might come into contact with the corpse and the secret documents it carried, to perform the script written in London. It was a strange kind of helplessness. You threw a ball and could only wait to see whether it followed the arc you had calculated and dropped into the basket. If it drifted even slightly, the entire plan, and the lives of thousands of soldiers it was meant to shield, could be swallowed by disaster. But how had it come to this? Why stake something so important on a cold body? Turn the clock back a little, back to when the smoke was not yet so thick and the anxiety not yet so sharp. The place might still be London, or another equally guarded room where doors closed softly and voices stayed low. The time was the spring of 1943. The Mediterranean War had become a board of interlocking moves. The Allies needed a major next offensive, aimed at the soft underbelly of Hitler's so-called Fortress Europe. Among the most vital, and among the most heavily defended, was the large island of Sicily. It sat like an unsinkable aircraft carrier at the center of the Mediterranean, gripping the sea lanes and demanding to be taken. The Allies needed to land in Sicily. Everyone understood the danger. If the defenders correctly predicted the landing site, they could concentrate their forces and destroy the invaders on the beaches. The sea would run red. The cost would be catastrophic. So the question was simple and brutal. How do you make Hitler and his high command believe the Allies are not going to Sicily at all, but somewhere else? Greece, perhaps? Sardinia, perhaps? Somewhere that pulled attention and resources away from the true target. Traditional deception, planting rumors, using double agents to pass along vague intelligence, might help. But it was not strong enough. At the highest strategic level, to mislead a vast, suspicious imperial intelligence system, you needed more than gossip. You needed evidence. Evidence that did not look deliberately delivered, but accidentally obtained. Evidence that could survive the harshest scrutiny, because it appeared to have come into enemy hands in the ordinary friction of war. And so an idea, almost insane, yet lit by a cold logic, reached the table. If you could not guarantee that false intelligence would travel safely by living courier, why not send it by a dead one? A courier who would never misspeak, never defect, never grow careless at the wrong moment. His very presence would carry a tragic plausibility. A drowned Allied officer, supposedly the victim of an air crash. Let him carry top-secret documents and wash up near an enemy-friendly shore. Let the enemy happen to find him, find the documents, and then draw conclusions the enemy would treat as his own. That idea became Operation Mincemeat. In the heavy files of the UK National Archives, you can still find catalogue entries connected to it, with references such as HW20/546. Silent proof that this was not a street legend, but a national-level deception project, seriously planned, approved, and executed. The papers are calm, the moment that produced them was not, but approval was only the first step. The truly sleepless problems began the moment the plan was authorized. One of the principal planners, in a later retelling, put the essence of the work in a single line. "Gentlemen, our challenge is not to invent a clever enough lie. Our challenge is to design a production line that ensures the lie will pass automatically through the Germans' rigorous intelligence screening process." That sentence is the key to understanding Operation Mincemeat. This was not a parlor trick, not a contest to see who could tell the prettiest story. It was precision engineering aimed at the enemy's system of belief. The subject of study was not the content of the story, but how the enemy would verify a story. What did their checklist look like? How would they validate the identity of a drowned officer? What format, language, and paper trail would a secret document need before German specialists would judge it real? First, you needed a person. A real-feeling Major William Martin. He could not be merely a label stuffed into a uniform. He had to be an evidence package, built so that doubt, when applied to it, would slide off in predictable ways. The work began under absolute secrecy. It was nothing like the romance of spy novels. It was closer to an exercise in extreme tedium, an endless puzzle, demanding infinite precision. Every piece had to fit so tightly that it could withstand inspection from any angle. A uniform and identity discs were basic, but far from sufficient. What would an officer on a secret overseas mission carry? A wallet. And what would be inside it? Pounds in the right mix of old and new notes, a handful of coins, small things that looked as if they had been handled and forgotten. Perhaps a club membership card that had only recently expired. A photograph in civilian clothes, maybe with a girlfriend, which required a real woman's picture, and forged love letters filled with private emotion, creased as if they had been read more than once. He might have money troubles. So they manufactured a letter from a London pay office, official in tone and faintly impatient, reminding Major Martin that his account was slightly overdrawn. On its face, it was an unflattering detail. In truth, it was exactly the kind of annoyance that made a life feel real. What officer had not been pestered by small bureaucratic indignities? What had he seen lately? He might have ticket stubs from a London theatre. What hobbies did he have? Perhaps a letter from his father mentioning the family dog, or complaining about the weather. They even considered the possibility of a shopping receipt left in a trouser pocket. None of these objects were tossed in at random. They were connected, mutually reinforcing, woven into a coherent portrait of a man living in a specific time and place. A man with warmth, irritations, and social ties. In some common retellings, someone on the team even suggested giving the corpse an apartment key. The key would never open a real door, but it was a perfect everyday prop, highly lifelike, and impossible to verify on the spot. In the end, the idea was rejected as too risky. If the key were discovered to be fake, everything might collapse. But the proposal itself revealed their philosophy. Build reality through detail, then weigh every detail against the risk it might introduce. They were not chasing richness for its own sake. They were chasing survivable scrutiny. The hardest piece, of course, was the central, secret document. It could not be a bald letter stating "We are not attacking Sicily." That would scream fraud. It had to be subtler, more plausible, more consistent with how senior leaders actually communicated. The chosen centerpiece was a copy of a letter from the British Army's Deputy Chief of Staff to General Alexander, commanding operations in North Africa. The letter, casually phrased yet dense with implication, discussed future actions in the Mediterranean. It presented Greece and Sardinia as attractive objectives and hinted that Sicily was, at most, a cover problem. It even mentioned Major Martin in passing, implying he was the courier carrying the papers. Forging that letter was an art form. It required the correct paper, format, stamps, and administrative marks. The signature had to be an exact imitation. The language had to match the deputy chief's habits, down to preferred abbreviations, specific terms, even harmless stock phrases. The smallest deviation could awaken suspicion in German document examiners. To avoid that, the forgers studied large numbers of real documents, capturing subtleties no amateur would think to mimic. This was a contest with an invisible opponent. The opponent was not a single person, but an entire process of doubt. A German intelligence officer would ask, "Does the manner of acquisition seem natural? Does the content cross-check with other information we possess? Does the physical condition, water stains, damage, fit the story of a body drifting at sea with documents on it? Is the professional quality beyond reproach?" And beneath those questions was an even simpler reflex. If anything feels too eager to persuade, it is probably bait. So the planners had to stand inside the German officer's head in advance and seed answers in the body's pockets and in the briefcase. They were building not only a story, but a set of expected objections and the quiet, ordinary artifacts that would diffuse them. When everything was prepared and placed carefully into the leather case that was meant to get wet, a strange feeling settled over the participants. They had created a person who never existed, yet possessed a more complete life file than many real men. He had love, debt, family annoyances, and above all, a vital mission. The more complete the fiction became, the more uncomfortable the act of completing it could feel. And then, with a sharp click, the briefcase lock closed. A more unsettling phase began. You could control every detail of the story, but how could you control the story's opening scene? How could you ensure that Major Martin, carrying his story, would enter the enemy's sight in the way you needed? The corpse was only the vessel. The real problem was simple. How do you guarantee the enemy gets it the way you want? Throwing a body into the sea and hoping the tide delivered it to someone useful sounded like pure gambling, and the stakes were far too high. So the delivery became a science. The location had to be chosen with care, a coastline belonging to a neutral country such as Spain, whose intelligence services nonetheless had a long history of contact with Germany. That way, after Spanish authorities discovered the body, German operatives would be able to access the papers, copy them, and send them onward. Timing required calculations of tides and winds, so the drift would make sense. Even the condition of the corpse, how long it had been in the water, the degree of damage, had to be controlled so that it matched the invented timeline of an air crash and a drowned officer. All of it served a single final purpose: to ensure the false intelligence was not handed to the enemy but discovered by the enemy, taken, analyzed, and ultimately accepted by the enemy's own reasoning. They did not want the enemy merely to hear a claim. They wanted the enemy to verify it and reach the wrong conclusion themselves. The lie had to feel like their conclusion, not London's suggestion. When the British submarine carrying Major William Martin slipped toward the designated waters under cover of darkness, the men in London had nothing left to do but wait. They had handed in a test they could no longer revise, and the examiner was one of the most skeptical opponents on earth. Now, the test had been delivered. In the smoke-filled London room, the telegraph's ticking seemed to change. Perhaps it truly did. Perhaps it was only the mind grasping at signals. They stared at the map as if their eyes could pierce land and sea and reach the Spanish beach. See the cold body soon to be pushed by waves onto the sand. See the hand that would reach for the briefcase. In that stare was a kind of exhaustion, the knowledge that imagination was now the only instrument left. The plan entered its most silent, most terrifying stage. All they could do was wait for an echo. The sea's cold was another kind of silence. The submarine moved soundlessly beneath the dark swells, like a giant metal ghost. The timing was calculated with near-cruel precision. The location was a specific patch of water off the coast near Huelva. Tides, moon, and wind direction were computed and recomputed. The goal was not immediate discovery, but an appearance consistent with a plausible drift path, one that oceanographers and pathologists would later find reasonable. A hatch opened. Darkness and sea wind poured in together. A few sailors, cautious and fast, moved the burdened package out. He wore the neatly arranged uniform of a major. The life jacket looked as if it had once been inflated. Now it sat slack. The crucial leather briefcase was chained firmly to his wrist. It was the last physical link between officer and mission, severed only by death. The motion was practical, almost procedural, and that was part of the point. The less it looked like theatre, the less it left behind to betray intention. Hands supported him, then let go. A heavy splash, quickly swallowed by the breath of waves. The dark shape rose and fell a few times on the phosphorescent surface, then began to drift, slowly, toward the chosen shore, toward the unknown. The submarine dove and withdrew, leaving no trace. Everything returned to the sea. The part of the plan controlled by human hands ended there, completely. The rest belonged to natural law, to chance, and to the opponent. This was the most gut-tightening philosophical moment of the whole operation. You did everything possible to design an accident that looked airtight, but you still had to admit that you could not control real accidents. An overly curious fish, an unexpected storm, a fisherman off course. Any tiny variable might send the carefully prepared body to the bottom forever, or to some forgotten corner where it would rot in silence. Probability does not negotiate, and it does not care what you were trying to save. In London, the planners endured the hardest days after the release. No news. Radio silence. On the map, the sea looked calmly indifferent. The sensation of hanging in mid-air was more punishing than any definite bad report. They had invested immeasurable intelligence, resources, and hope, and yet, this time, fate seemed to run along the track they had built. Days later, a message from Spain, passed through discreet channels, reached London at last. A British officer's body had washed up on the Huelva beach. The identity was preliminarily confirmed as Major William Martin. His personal effects, including the briefcase, had been seized by local authorities. The report added that the Spanish took the matter seriously because it involved an Allied officer and potentially confidential documents. The room did not relax. If anything, the air tightened. The plan's next stage began automatically. It was a scene they could not watch with their own eyes, yet had to play in their heads with precision. The false file was entering the enemy's digestive system. The moment the bait was seen, their control ended, and the enemy's curiosity began to do the work. In many common narratives, what followed plays like a staged drama. Spanish military and intelligence services, among them people with close connections to Germany, took custody of the body and its effects. The briefcase was opened. Damp papers were carefully removed, dried, handled. The sensitivity of the contents, especially the letter signed by the British Deputy Chief of Staff, was enough to quicken any neutral official's pulse. You can almost see it, somewhere in Huelva or Madrid, in an office no one speaks about, under weak light, gloved hands turning each page. A camera shutter pressed softly, copying the contents. Then film copies moving along secure channels toward Berlin, onto the desk of experts in the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service. In London, the planners held their breath and tried to imagine each link in the chain. Would the documents draw enough attention? Would the copies be clear? Would the Germans get the full set? Every step had to work. The bait they had made now traveled down the pipes they had anticipated but could not control, flowing toward the predator. And the true test began. In Berlin, the Abwehr's document examiners, intelligence analysts, and higher-level strategists would dissect this accidental windfall with merciless care. They would check paper, ink, and water damage for consistency with the drift story. They would study every bend and pressure of the signature, comparing it to archived examples of the real deputy chief's handwriting. They would weigh each sentence and each word choice against their model of British senior thinking and the logic of the current war. They would look for the small, unforced friction of reality. And if a single element felt staged, their caution would stiffen into refusal. London's waiting shifted into a new, finer register. They were no longer waiting simply for a signal that the documents had been received. They were hunting for any sign that the enemy had believed them. Because the most successful deception is not that the opponent sees your lie. It is that the opponent begins to act on it. In this stage, the absence of action was not peace. It was the threat of a verdict. So the focus of the smoke-filled room moved quickly from a Spanish shoreline to a wider European intelligence map. They pulled on every available source. Agents in the field, intercepted radio traffic, aerial reconnaissance photographs, even subtle shifts in public reporting and internal communications. They became patient archaeologists, sifting an information ruin, searching for any shard that could be fitted into a picture of "the Germans are taking the bait." The first days were still silence, as if a stone had been thrown into a deep pool and no ripple returned. Then faint rings began to appear. An intercepted and decrypted German message suggested an unusual increase in aerial reconnaissance over Sardinia and in the Greek region. The number and scope exceeded routine patrol patterns. It looked targeted, detailed, like preliminary examination of a possible theatre. Reconnaissance, after all, is what you do when you have begun to take something seriously. Another piece of hazy intelligence, passed through neutral diplomatic channels, hinted that German leaders were reassessing the main direction of Mediterranean defense. The language was cautious, but the focus overlapped in intriguing ways with the target regions implied in the planted documents. More electrifying still were anomalies picked up through technical interception of German logistical and unit coordination. Supply routes, or engineering elements that might have been expected to reinforce Sicily, appeared delayed or redirected. Any one sign, on its own, could be explained away. Normal rotation, another emerging threat, the ordinary confusion of wartime administration. But as more fragments from unrelated sources accumulated on London desks, a pattern began to take shape. Like isolated stars that suddenly become a constellation once your eye connects them. The outline pointed in a single direction. German high command attention was being drawn towards Sardinia and Greece, and the pressure on Sicily, at least in the realm of expectation, seemed to ease. Arrows on the map began to move. Not immediate mass movement of divisions, that would be too obvious and would take time, but the invisible, decisive movement of emphasis in assessments, contingency plans, and priority lists. The center of gravity shifted. For the first time, the room's atmosphere loosened slightly. Brows did not fully unknit, but the long silence was replaced by low discussion. Men pointed at newly marked symbols and exchanged interpretations. Into the black waiting crept a thin, cautious thread of hope, like a spark inside ash. Have they bitten? The question ceased to be a pure interrogative and became a hypothesis, partially supported by evidence. No one dared to declare certainty. Intelligence in war flips and folds. The enemy could be running a double game, but when multiple independent traces all pointed toward the same wrong conclusion, it strongly suggested that the papers lifted from the sea were doing what they were meant to do. One participant later said the feeling was not triumph, but a deep, incredulous sense of confirmation. As though you designed an extremely complex lock, and from far away you heard a click. You know what that sound means, but you still have to wait for the door to actually open. Now they heard more than one click, faint and intermittent, but unmistakably coming from the direction of the keyhole they had built. The lie seemed to have entered the enemy's decision machinery and begun producing erroneous outputs. Yet, the sword did not fall. A deeper question rose alongside hope, heavier than before. All these paper successes, all these shifts of arrows in the intelligence world, what would they buy? In the real place that would be soaked with blood, on the beaches of Sicily. When the first landing craft drove toward shore, when ramps dropped, when young soldiers leapt into waist-deep water under machine gun fire? Would German defenses be weaker even by a fraction because they had believed a lie carried by a corpse? Could those silent arrows on a map become tens of minutes of hesitation, a few empty strongpoints, a slightly clearer route inland? In the intelligence room, deception might be approaching success, but its final examination would be on the battlefield, and the grading rubric was cruel and direct: lives. Hope, once lit, braided itself with anxiety into a sharper kind of waiting. In that London room, the arrows that marked shifting German attention were no longer cold symbols. They seemed to carry weight and heat, pointing toward a moment that reality would soon test. July 10th, 1943, the Sicily landings, Operation Husky, began. As thousands of ships crossed the Mediterranean under night, as airborne troops drifted inland like seeds scattered in darkness, as engines on landing craft broke the stillness before dawn and surged onto the sand, the men who had designed Operation Mincemeat reached their own D-Day alongside the soldiers at the front. Early reports arrived in flurries, confusing, violent, chaotic. But one crucial detail began to emerge from the raw. The German defense on Sicily's beaches, its speed and intensity seemed, compared to the worst forecasts, to be half a beat slower. On certain beaches expected to be brutally contested, Allied units established footholds with relative success. In the first critical hours, the Axis command structure showed a measure of confusion and hesitation. That hesitation was the commodity Operation Mincemeat tried to purchase. The aim was not to make the enemy abandon resistance, but to disrupt judgment and rhythm, to buy the priceless time needed to secure and expand a beachhead. Many later analyses of the campaign note that Operation Mincemeat, alongside other concurrent deception measures, succeeded in planting deep doubt in German high command. When Sicily was actually attacked, Hitler and his generals did hesitate in the first critical decision window, asking whether this was a feint and whether the real blow still lay elsewhere. Those hours, some say several, some say longer, opened a vital survival window for the landing force. Each minute of advantage could mean dozens, even hundreds of young lives not lost. In that sense, Mincemeat's victory was not written in decrypted briefings, but in the math of survival. It was a cold equation, using paper, imagination, and meticulous psychological calculation to trade for flesh and blood. After the war, as archives were declassified and participants' accounts surfaced, Operation Mincemeat gradually lost its aura of mystery and became a classic case study in intelligence history. In the UK National Archives, files with references such as WO106/5921 preserve official records of the operation. Those quiet papers confirm its existence, its scale, and the fact that authorities viewed it as an important success. But beyond tactical results, the story provokes a deeper echo. It forces reflection on the borderlands of truth, lies, and ethics in war. To use an anonymous dead man's body, to manufacture an identity, to make human remains into a deception instrument, an ethical unease hovered from the beginning. Was it disrespect? Or, under the overwhelming wartime logic of saving thousands of living men, could it be accepted as a necessary, if disturbing, cost? Different values yield different answers. One of the principal advocates later expressed complicated feelings, yet insisted the purpose was just: reduce Allied casualties and hasten the end of the war. That conviction does not erase the discomfort. It only explains how people carried it. Methodologically, Mincemeat left an even clearer legacy. It illustrates a core principle of high-level deception. The key is often not how clever the lie itself is, but whether you can design a credible chain of delivery and verification for it. You are not persuading one person. You are exploiting the operating rules of an entire system so that the system convinces itself. You study the opponent's procedures, habits, and suspicion checklist, and then reverse engineer a package that will pass every check, not by forcing belief, but by avoiding the triggers that produce disbelief. Many later retellings, including some by participants, summarize the essence this way. The most successful lie is not when you persuade the enemy, but when the enemy's own analysis persuades the enemy. It sounds like a maxim. Behind it lies an enormous amount of dull, detailed, high-pressure work. When the war became history and the smoke cleared, the beaches of Sicily returned to quiet, and Major William Martin, a man who never existed, sank into the deep sea of archives. His story ceased to be a secret operation plan and became a case, a study in how human beings deploy intelligence and deceit under extreme conflict. What we see here may not be only national cleverness or a team's talent. We see a vulnerability in human cognition itself. We tend to believe evidence that arrives through a reliable channel and that fits the fragments we already hold. Operation Mincemeat struck both weaknesses with precision. It forged a reliable channel in the form of an apparently accidental body and its papers, and it prepared false information that could be made to align with other intelligence, real or manufactured. So the story ultimately reaches beyond a single campaign. It becomes a metaphor, warning that what we insist is truth may not always be objectively discovered. Sometimes it is manufactured by a force with intent, and then, through our own verification logic, confirmed by us. In war, in politics, and in the daily flood of information, that possibility haunts the margins. Today, if you walk into the UK National Archives and request the files marked Operation Mincemeat, you will see yellowing pages, cool official language, meticulous reports. You will not feel the seas cold or smell the special inks used to forge documents or hear the near-still smoke and heartbeat in that London waiting room. But you will know it all happened. A battle without gunfire was fought and won on another front. Its weapons were psychology, theatre, an obsession with detail, and a deep understanding of how trust works. With a corpse, it blurred an empire's sight long enough to buy a precious direction for the real strike. When the archive room's door closes, everything returns to silence. But the core question seems to hover in the air. In the war over truth, the ultimate victory may be to make your opponent wholeheartedly believe the fact you prepared for him.